Hi, as was just said, my name is Josh Ho. I'm a policy analyst at Safe and Just Michigan. The bad news, there's a good news, bad news proposition. The bad news is this is probably my least favorite kind of speaking. Generally, what I like to do is extemporaneous speaking that involves me walking around the room and waving my arms around a lot. Unfortunately, I didn't write this report, so it's not intuitive to me in the same way that some other topics would be. So I did a prepared speech, and so I'll be doing a lot of reading. I don't have a PowerPoint or any of that stuff. But the good news is I will not be talking about the grids at all. So you got that going for you. So I don't know how many of you, like me, were around for the 1970s. Hopefully not too many of you. There's been a lot of differences from the 70s to now. I was trying to think of things, and, I grew up in New York City, and one of the things I thought of that was a major difference was that when I was a kid, if you went to Times Square, it was not necessarily a good thing in the 70s, and now it's pretty family friendly, so that was a big change. I guess when I was a kid, we had rotary phones, and now we got the smartphones, so I think that's probably a relatively good change. Although, I kind of am nostalgic for the time where I didn't have to think about where my phone was at all times. But there have also been some not so good changes since the 70s. For instance, starting in the 1970s, we started a national bipartisan experiment committed to putting a lot more people in our prisons and jails. As the Brennan Center put it, incarceration grew both at the federal and state level, but most of the growth was in the states, which housed the vast majority of the nation's prisoners. The number of prisoners grew in every state, blue, red, urban, and rural. I remember when I was a kid, people actually firmly believed that people who committed a crime were and should be getting rehabilitation, and then when they got back from incarceration, that they had served their debt to society. Somehow, over the ensuing decades, we became committed to a much harsher view of prison, where you actually often see people celebrating and cheering for violence in our prisons, and to a mindset of locking people up and throwing away the key. And now at the state level, our prison populations are increasingly made up of people with long and indeterminate sentences. This was certainly true in Michigan and continues here today. In the 1970s, less than 5% of people sentenced for second-degree murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and armed robbery had minimums greater than 20 years. Today, that number is often as many as 15 times greater. We could probably spend hours talking about why this happened. We've had over 30 years of tough-on-crime television and movies. We have media that largely programs and churns out column inches using the mantra, if it bleeds, it leads. And way too often, we tend to legislate from anecdotes as opposed to data. But there is also a deep-seated belief that long sentences are just desserts. Many people believe that when someone has done serious harm, they should do substantial time. This report is certainly not trying to suggest that those people are necessarily wrong, but I do think it is important to note that what does seem to have changed since the 1970s is our perception of what substantial time means. Where in the 1970s, people thought that a 10 or 20-year sentence was significant, now we see sentences of 40, 50, 60, or even hundreds of years. In fact, over 40% of the current population of people incarcerated in Michigan's prisons are serving a sentence of over 10 years, when in 1993, the number of incarcerated people serving this kind of sentence was 21%. And today, around 20% of Michigan's population of incarcerated people is serving a term of over 25 years or of life, while internationally, the 44 countries whose data is reported by the Council of Europe suggests that only 1.5% of their incarcerated populations were serving a sentence of over 20 years. Michigan might be in step with this unfortunate national trend, but that trend itself is out of step with history and out of step with the rest of the world. This change in thinking about crime and sentencing over the past decades has probably also had other effects. For instance, crime has largely become disaggregated from prison sentences. As crime has generally decreased over the last decades, Our prison population has largely stayed the same. And yes, lately, Michigan's prison population has declined. But if what we've been doing is clearing out what has been called the low-hanging fruit of people with shorter sentences, this has happened while our sentencing practices have pushed for more severity. The result will largely be larger, longer, and more aging prison populations. It is also very useful to look again at these recent declines through a historical lens. In 1993, our prison population was 38,942, and in 2017, our prison population was 39,666. And perhaps most interesting, during that same period, index crimes plummeted by more than 56%. Again, there could be many causes for this, but I suspect it has something to do with how people who have not been directly impacted by crime perceive stories about crime as opposed to how they personally experienced crime. But that again is beyond the scope of this report. At the end of the day, crime has largely been in decline, with the exception of a homicide and domestic violence spike through the pandemic period, while long sentences and incarceration have continued to increase. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, as was mentioned at the top of this thing, I am formerly incarcerated. I'm a formerly incarcerated person. So I can speak to some of this with a great deal of firsthand experience and with some authority. And if you ask any formerly incarcerated person, and there's several in the room, who they are most worried about in our prisons, it is almost never the people who are doing long sentences. In fact, in most prisons in Michigan, the folks doing life sentences are leaders and often represent the glue keeping down violence in our prisons. Generally, in my experience, the most violent prisons in Michigan are level 1 prisons and not the higher level prisons. This accords with decades of evidence that suggests both that people who commit serious crimes have very low recidivism rates, and also with decades of evidence that suggests that crime is a young person's game and that people generally age out of crime. Sonia Starr and J.J. Prescott, two researchers, put out a study a few years ago which used Michigan data and suggested that people who are over 50 and served at least 5 years have an active recidivism rate of less than 1%. They also concluded that policies that seek to shrink the expansive prison population while ignoring prisoners who have committed violent offenses will fail to address the cause of the problem. Ultimately, as these numbers continue to increase, any hope of reform will have to center around people whose crimes are considered violent or serious if we want to have any hope of meaningful reductions in our prison population. As criminologist, economist, and law professor John Pfaff put it in his book Locked In, any significant reduction in U.S. prison population is going to require states and counties to rethink how they punish people convicted of violent crimes, where rethink means think about how to punish less. We will need to move away from pretrial prison classification and parole decisions without using the violent label, and we'll have to shorten prison sentences and lengths of stay for people convicted of violent offenses. We will have to consider changing our sentencing guidelines and investing in back-end reforms like prosecutor-initiated second look or more general second look legislation. You might have heard me just say that and ask, why do we need to change these things? Well, obviously, the first reason is the human cost. I have a lot of friends who did long sentences and have come back to their communities and become important and valuable members of those communities. I often tell the story of my friend who, after just a few years of being resentenced and released from a juvenile life without parole sentence, was opening warming centers in his neighborhood during the polar vortex. People change, and over decades of time, that change is almost inevitable. One of my friends, a Vietnam veteran who came back after doing 40 years in prison, was so impactful in his community that he was elected a Bishop's Committee member of his church after 1 year home. But unfortunately, due to years of poor health care when he was inside, he went mostly blind just a year after release. This is someone I'm very close to, and I often wonder if his sight might have been saved just by letting him out to get good medical care a few years earlier. There is also a net widening problem. As we have become more committed to ensuring that serious crimes get treated with ever-increasing consequences, we have started to label more and more crimes as violent crimes, as serious crimes, as habitual crimes, and even as serious misdemeanors in order to ensure that more and more people get longer and longer sentences. And this net widening has real impacts on the respect for the law. For all the talk of the Ferguson effect, there is also the very real possibility that has been borne out in research that the different standards by which we judge violence has real implications on how people perceive the credibility of our legal system. As law professor David Sklansky explained in his recent book, A Pattern of Violence, the common distinction between violent and nonviolent acts played virtually no role in criminal law before the latter half of the 20th century. Yet to this day, with more crimes than ever called violent, the distinction determines how we judge the seriousness of an offense, as well as the perpetrator's debt and danger to society. Similarly, criminal law today treats violence as a pathology of individual character, but in other areas of law, including the procedural law that covers police conduct, the situational context of violence carries more weight. The result of these inconsistencies and of society's unique fear of violence since the 1960s has been an application of law that reinforces inequities of race and class, undermining the law's legitimacy. I think we've seen this throughout the country over the last few years. There are also massive monetary costs. The cost, for instance, of incarcerating just one person convicted of armed robbery has grown over the last decades by $124,000. That's just for one person. Lengthening the average sentence of 100 people in prison for armed robbery cost taxpayers over $12 million. According to the House Fiscal Agency, over the 15-year period from 2006 to 2020, per prisoner costs for health care increased by an average of 7% annually. And almost certainly the largest driver of that cost was people doing long and indeterminate sentences. And if you look at any budget breakdowns, almost always the largest cost of incarceration is healthcare costs these days. We have very crowded prisons. We have an aging prison population. And in this time of the pandemic, we have staffing shortages and a lot more people needing healthcare. And obviously, there are public safety costs. When Jennifer Granholm doubled the number of people paroled in 2009, the data shows that over 99% of these folks who were paroled never returned to prison. We also tend to believe that prisons are a solution to crime. There have been numerous studies, including a very good meta-analysis by Rudman of the Open Philanthropy Project, that concluded that prison is no panacea. The best estimate of the marginal impact of incarceration on crime in the U.S. today is 0. The claims that increasing the severity of incarceration even mildly deters appear weak. After effects appear to cancel out incapacitation in most contexts. Mueller-Smith's formidable study goes strongly the other way. After effects do not merely cancel out incapacitation, but easily surpass it in magnitude, and most likely deterrence as well, so that incarceration increases crime at the margin. Meanwhile, all of the studies reviewed probably leave out most of the crime increases in prison that comes from putting more people there. And I want to talk about that for a second, because not only have I experienced that firsthand, but it is something we almost never talk about. Prisons generate violence inside. Many people are subject to violence and trauma on a regular basis, and some people even die. In fact, over 150 people, mostly people with long and indeterminate sentences, have died in Michigan prisons just over the last 2 years as the result of the pandemic. One has to wonder how many of these 150 human beings remained a real public safety risk, and how many people in their communities, their parents, their kids, their friends, their partners, mourn their loss every single day. Was it really necessary to keep all these people inside for such long sentences? As Dr. Homer Venners talked about in his book, Life and Death in Rikers Island, incarceration harms health in the United States. We have become the world's most voracious jailers. Without truly understanding how the places where we send people increase their risk for death and serious injury, we blame the incarcerated for whatever might happen to them behind bars. And many of the people we are leaving behind bars were themselves traumatized by crime. People's stories are often much more complicated and nuanced than the simple descriptions of subhuman monsters that we hear so often on television. Several years ago, Dr. Bruce Western did a sociological study of people returning home from prison in Boston. He published a book about it and said, "Violence is a lifetime reality for people who go to prison. It grows out of the chaotic context of poverty and its accompanying disadvantages. Given the contextual character of violence, the roles of victim, witness, and perpetrator are not neatly divided among individuals. Instead, one comes to play all of these parts as their life course unfolds. A key implication is those with a history of offending have been victims and witnesses to violence for even longer." This is so critical. It is so important that we look beyond the solutions that have largely failed us for so long and open ourselves to new ideas. When you meet the people who have been through this, you know that that there have to be better ways. Bruce Western also said, "This moral complexity, where victims and offenders are often one and the same, is challenging for a justice system designed to assess guilt or innocence and mete out punishment. Historically, we have punished violence as an assault of the strong on the weak. The larger challenge now is to heal the frailty from which violence springs." I understand how complicated all this is. As someone who has been both a victim and perpetrator myself, it took me years to make sense of my own feelings about all of this and come to some conclusions about what needs to be done. Politically, this may often seem impossible, but in the last 5 years, I've seen a huge amount of meaningful changes, and the people in this room have a lot of collective power. Even when the going is going to require changing a lot of hearts and minds in the process, and hopefully conferences like this play a part in that. What good does it do anyone to continue to be part of a so-called solution that makes the core problems facing our communities even worse? At times, it might make good politics, but it never makes for good policies. At the end of the day, we should be about trying to make our Michigan communities safer. As the authors of this report that we're talking about today concluded, imposing long sentences in the name of public protection is both ironic and counterproductive. Such sentences are unsupported by actual data on recidivism and are often most imposed on the people who are the least likely to repeat their offenses. They substantially hamper the ability of people to be productive and self-sufficient when they are eventually released, and they require taxpayers to spend tens of millions of dollars annually for the illusion of increased safety. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the day in the report. I will now take any questions you have, but they've asked me to tell you to use the microphones if you're going to ask a question. Thanks. Any questions? Okay. Okay, Joe. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we're really hoping will get done this year, although it's not specific to this report, is making juvenile life without parole sentences no longer a part of Michigan law. Given how many people have already been resentenced for that, I'm hopeful that we can do something with that.
So is this on? Okay, so the long people serving long indeterminate sentences in the Michigan prisons, we depend on them in some way to help mentor the prison population. So what do we say to people who kind of use that against the argument that we should not have people serving long indeterminate sentences, and that there's sort of a trade-off there to the benefit?
I mean, yeah, there's definitely a trade-off in the sense that if you take the people who are serving long and indeterminate sentences out of prison, that they can no longer mentor the people who are still in prison. But I would hate to have to instrumentalize those people's lives and make them only a servant to trying to be mentors for other people in prison when they could come out and live their lives and be with their families and their loved ones. So to me, the most important thing is that people get home, they get home in better place than when they left, and they get to reunite with their families and try to make a productive life for themselves. So yes, I do think that is to some extent a concern, but I'm much more worried about those human beings getting to do what they want to do with their lives. We can certainly find other ways to mentor folks in prison if it means that people like me or other people in the room go back. You know, I'm sure all of us would be more than willing to do that. Well, thank you very much.